My name is Sam Hall, and this is the RBC Louisville podcast. I am with Pastor Jim Savasio today. Pastor Jim, how are you?
I'm doing well, Sam. How about you?
I'm good. I'm
Good.
good. Um, One of the things I want to talk about today is um, last night you preached for 58 minutes. Did you mean to do that?
No,
Okay.
I normally aim for about 45 minutes.
All the babies were crying.
All
at
the
the
babies
end.
were crying. All the people in the nursery were sad. Yes.
No. But I think we kind of want to talk about like 58 minutes, 45 minutes, an hour and 15 minutes. What
30
is the
minutes.
right length for a sermon? Is there a right length for a sermon? And I kind of want to get your perspective on that as a preacher for 35 years, 45 years.
Yeah, sure.
Um,
Yeah.
Kind of what's been the evolution of that thinking?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think we can answer it generically, and I can maybe give a little bit of history on some of that. I always think of a little story that Charles Spurgeon told to a young man who preached too long. And Spurgeon's statement to him was, "You preached me into a good mood, and you preached me out of it." And so, what he meant by that obviously was like, okay, that was a perfect time to wrap. And I will confess, there have been certain times where I've listened to a sermon and I have thought, that's it, he's done, and all of a sudden we're chasing a rabbit, or there's a tangent going on. So it's like the end of, Return of the King or something like that, where it has 5 or 6 different endings, and you're starting to get up out of the seat. Oh, now they're doing this. Or, well, now it's done, and nope, now it's then it's. And I want to be careful, obviously, because we're talking about teaching and preaching and the word. We need to have reverence in discussing that. But there are human instruments involved, and people have their own personalities and their own quirks. So our tradition, the Reformed tradition, and particularly kind of the Reformed Baptists that were my heroes and that had an influence on me, were men that preached generally somewhere in the 50, 55, an hour, sometimes an hour 10, hour 20, hour and a half sermons. And there was almost a sort of pride that we can listen. Everybody else is getting sermonettes and they're just getting little homilies and little ditties, but we can take it,
Big boy
And
sermon.
it was, all right, these are big boy sermons, and these are sermons for tough Christians who can really gut it out. And that was kind of at least the impression I got. I felt almost a certain degree of pride, and the thought is, well, you can sit and listen to, watch a movie, a 3-hour movie and you don't move, or an hour and a half movie and you don't move, and yet, you can't take a sermon, and this is the most important thing in the world, etc. And there are a lot of different things that go into this. But my ultimate answer to, how long is a sermon, it should be enough to effectively communicate the truth of that passage. Now, with the recognition that you need to be able to preach this to real people and to real families, sitting in real chairs, and in some cases, very uncomfortable settings. There are some pews you've been to or chairs you've been to. It's not particularly comfortable, and so you might want to, think to yourself, okay, there's a statement, I think, something the mind cannot absorb, but the body cannot endure, or what the rear cannot endure.
I've been to some of the weddings you've preached at, and there's been conditions where you've had to shorten things because
I'm now see, one of the things I do in weddings, so again, our in some of our tradition, some of my Reformed Baptist brethren who may listen to this, at a wedding, they may take time to preach a sermon, sometimes 40 minutes long, and you'll know. I did your wedding, did your wedding, right? Did I do your wedding? No, John did your wedding. Oh man, got David's over here.
we're acknowledging
Yeah, just
the
that
hidden.
sadness. That's right. I was rejected. All the pain is coming back to me now. But to go ahead and take.
I'm thinking of wedding in particular when it
Oh,
was
when it,
on
you
the
know, when
top
it
of the
was
hill and
on
like
the top of the hill, and it was 10 degrees out.
10 degrees with like a
and
50
wind.
mile an hour wind
Yeah.
going across.
Yeah, and that thing is like, okay, we're going to shorten this. We're going to get people into a warm building.
Yeah.
So there are extenuating circumstances. It's really hot. Air conditioning goes out or whatever. It's really hot. People are falling asleep. whatever the situation is, you want to be able to communicate. So I have a thing I say sometimes to some people, and that is, the purpose of communication is to communicate. It doesn't matter how well you preach or how true what you're preaching is, if people can't absorb it or understand it or be able to take it in, and sometimes that might be because you're not clear or you're not illustrative, or you've broken up the passage in a way that's confusing, or again, you've gone on too long, and what people are thinking about now is how long you're going on, and that's not what you want people to be thinking about. And you have to understand that maybe that can be rebuked or reproved, that if people were more spiritual or whatever. But people utilize the illustration of, well, the Puritans sat for 2 hours. Yeah, but they also had people going around waking people up in the services, and I understand in some cases they had like a rod with a rope and a wooden ball at the end of it. They'd bonk people on the head. Yeah, people sat there for 2 hours, but did they receive it for 2 hours? And you want to not only give the word, you want to have the word received, and that's something that's really been impressed on my heart lately. Is not just to, I mean, I want to preach the word with power, and a lot of people pray, Lord, help pastor to preach with power, but I'm really almost obsessing to a degree more like, no, I want you to hear with power. Because a sermon preached with power may be a good sermon, but a sermon heard with power is transformative or can be transformative in a life. And so I think there are a number of things that go into that and the ability of people to hear, but one of them is, and this is the point of what we're getting at today, is length. And so, how long does it take to communicate that truth? I'm of the mind, Sam, and you've given presentations and whatnot, and maybe you could speak to this. Would you say that the more you understand what you're saying, the easier it is to be succinct, and that when you would find yourself going on, and I don't know if I want to use the word rambling, it's because you're actually having a hard time really getting your hands on it. Is that, would you
I
say that's the case?
completely agree with that. I think that there's actually there's a saying from, I think, one of the presidents, where he was writing a letter to somebody, and he said that within his letter he didn't have enough time to write them a short letter because of the fact that it takes time to understand and be concise about what you're talking about.
That's good. Yeah, and so again, so sometimes you got to say there are certain times, and there may be certain topics and certain events where you need to get a fair amount of material out, and so last night was one of those where I had a one-off sermon. It wasn't a part of my regular expository series, and I had a fair bit that I really felt was very, very burdened to say. And this, for me, was not necessarily a case of I felt I could cut. I felt like there were things there was an argument that needed to be built and needed to be made, and in that case, it took some time. I'm sure I could have trimmed it down a little bit. I was actually a little surprised. But there are other things that go into all of this, and the help of the Lord and what you're talking about, how you communicate, and to use again something like a film. Sometimes somebody can watch a 3-hour film and it feels like an hour and a half. You can watch another film that's an hour and a half and it feels like 4 hours because it's just boring. And somebody said about, again, use the movie analogy, an old movie critic, Roger Ebert, said, a good movie can't be too long and a bad movie can't be too short. And I think, to a degree, and I always compare things to the Christian life and the ministry, so when I heard him say that, I thought about, is it possible that, can a good sermon be too long? Well, I think that's possible. If you're going to have a bad sermon, at least have the graciousness to make it short. Or if you're struggling, a lot can be forgiven with brevity.
Absolutely.
And so I think particularly early on, and I didn't do this as much as I should have, and I think I actually preached longer when I was younger. And I actually had one of the men in the church came to me one time and he said, I want to talk to you about your preaching. And he said, you beat a point to death. And it's like, we trust you. You've done your work. We believe you. when you give two verses to prove your point, that's sufficient. You don't
Right.
have to do 4, 5, 6, 7 to make sure that we're all convinced. And he said you can move on, and that helped me to like okay, and so part of the last bit of my preparation then began to be more like, okay, I've already said this, I don't need to say this again. I already said that earlier. That's repetitive. That doesn't necessarily need to be given, and that helped me to shape. And my preaching went from being generally about an hour then to generally beginning to hit the 45-minute mark. Now, I have preached longer than that. In fact, I had one time I preached at a conference, and I actually went back. I listened to the opening of it, and I said something like, we're going to finish these things up today. I've already dealt with this material, so I should be able to be relatively brief. And I preached an hour and 20 minutes. I saw that afterward because when it was posted, and I thought that's got to be a mistake. I thought, well, maybe that includes Q&A because we did a Q&A. I thought, well, I did. I somehow
Wow.
I went hour and 20 minutes.
That's wild.
That was I wasn't happy with myself. For that, so.
I mean, I think you bring up a really good point about brevity, and like kind of picking and choosing what things you focus on, because obviously inside of a passage, there's 100 different directions you could go
Sure.
at all times. I mean, it's something that I kind of deal with within the corporate world,
Right.
as far as like I'm in a consultant's role.
Right.
I'm in a pre-sale role where I'm going to be pitching different elements of what we do as a consultant for other people. There's 100 different directions I could take
Sure.
that, depending on what the person needs, and it's really up to me to figure out like what is the like one or two directions that I really need to like focus on,
Right.
and make sure that message is very clear. And it takes time to create that concise message. I think about like again within the corporate world, because that's the one that I'm most familiar with. Things like TED Talks.
Right.
Usually like 18 to 25 minutes
Right.
or so, to drive home a point. One of the things we talk about, I don't know if it ever comes up in like sermon write or anything, is to help people make sure that they understand like what point you actually are talking about within the or what your theme is in the message you're trying to bring.
Right.
Is tell them what you're about to tell them.
Right.
Tell them.
And tell them what you told them.
Tell them what you told them.
Yeah. People use that in preaching as well.
I'm sure.
Yeah.
I feel like it would be very applicable. So very interested in like kind of what your thoughts were there, but then what do you feel about like sermons that are below the 45-minute mark? Because that's very non-Reformed Baptist.
It is, but it can be effective. I had 2 times this past month. I was preaching in 2 different churches, one in Pine Bluff, Arkansas, and then at a installation service or an ordination in Seattle, SeaTac area. And in both cases, I was participating in a service where I did about 20 minutes, and I say that I think that's what I did. I have not looked at the final product, but I'm pretty confident I kept it to about 20 minutes.
20
and I was
minutes.
asked to. So I preached as a new sermon, a text I'd never preached on before. I was in one case assigned a text, Psalm 119:16, and so about 20 minutes. And then the next week I was part of, 2 of us preached at the installation service. One gave a charge to the congregation, and then I gave a charge to the pastor, and we were trying to do it, each of us to do our part in about 22, 23 minutes. And by God's grace, able to write a new sermon, but thinking to myself, okay, I need to ensure if I got 23 minutes, I got to use those 23 minutes, 22, 23 minutes to really get to it. So you can't expound the way you can, but it's helpful sometimes to say, look, I'm going to give you the most salient points of this, and I'm going to try to give it in such a way you can understand it and apply it. And it doesn't necessarily take an hour, 2 hours to be able to do that. And so I think it can be a good exercise from time to time. maybe when a pastor's preaching for the Lord's Supper, or where there's a business meeting or a congregational meeting afterward, to say, I'm going to be able to give the truth, and I want to try to really do a laser focus on it, and keep in mind that I want to maybe preach 35 minutes here, or something like that.
Right.
You take the sermons in the Bible, and how long did they take? How long did the Sermon on the Mount take? Well, I mean, if you just read it, it wouldn't take but maybe 15 minutes, 10, 15 minutes to be able to read it. I think that our Lord said more than that. But there are certain sermons when you think to yourself, okay, how long was the sermon on the day of Pentecost, or how long was Stephen's sermon in Acts chapter 7, or one of Paul's sermons in Acts 13 or 17 or something like that. And again, it doesn't take long to read them. They're really able to be given in short order, and the heart of them and the power of them is able to be conveyed in fewer words than we sometimes speak. So I don't know that there's any. I think you need to know your congregation. I think you need to know your gift. I think most men, particularly starting out, would be wise to preach shorter sermons. And as you learn, as you grow, and you have the ability and the gift to be able to hold people's attention, because that's what you want. You have to recognize, I'm talking to people, I'm talking to young people, talking to children. I want to be able to hold their attention, and if I'm losing them, then that's not always on them. Sometimes it's on me, and I need to do a better job of communicating, and sometimes communicating more succinctly.
That's good. That's good. Of course, Paul did preach that one where the guy
fell asleep.
window and
Eutychus fell
died,
asleep.
So, yeah.
So there's that. So
there
I can
is
always
that.
use that as an excuse. But Luke says, and as he spoke on and on.
Exactly.
It's a very interesting way of describing what went
Yes.
on. So
Did you notice, just kind of wrap up here, did you notice in some of your experience preaching 20-minute sermons, hour and 20-minute sermons, any particular pros and cons for the listeners, or was it truly just that is the length that fit the listener?
I'm probably not the best one to answer it, because it would probably be better to talk to one of the listeners.
Probably would.
I have sometimes people say, I wish you'd gone on longer. I would far rather them say, I wish you'd gone on longer, than say, boy, that last 10 minutes lost me. And it almost, again, to use Spurgeon, you preached me out of a good mood.
Yep.
And that would be sad to think, that I took so long to get to where I wanted to go, or where I felt I needed to go. Now again, brother, there are other, because this is preaching, there are the dynamics of the Holy Spirit, and it's not just human gift. There are times God visits, and I have sat in congregations where others have preached, in a congregation, you would have no idea that was an hour and 10-minute long sermon. It felt like 10 minutes. The Spirit was there, present. There was such power. There's a story I'll tell quickly as we finish here. Al Martin was preaching at a conference, one of the family conferences years ago, and I think this was in Tennessee, done by a church in North Carolina, put it on. But he was preaching, and as he was preaching on Christ in the Garden of Gethsemane, in the auditorium, the lights went out. And people didn't know what had happened at first. And then eventually they came back on. Well, he just kept preaching. But what had happened was there were hundreds of people in this room, and that's one of these rooms with motion detectors. And if it detects that there's no motion for 10 or 15 minutes, it shuts the lights off. There were hundreds of people sitting there in such rapt attention to the preaching of the word that the motion detectors thought the room was empty. People weren't going to the bathroom. People weren't walking around. There was none of that stuff that very often happens here, that so often happens that it's sometimes discouraging and distracting. It's like, come on, folks, you can make it for 40 minutes, of exposition. This is important. But in that case, so many people sat with such rapt attention that the lights went out. So that's, again, this God can help by the Spirit, that people are riveted to what is being said. And that's really ultimately what you want, not because you're a good communicator, but because the Spirit of God is working so powerfully.